Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bleav in Bengals podcast. Solomon Wilcots, along with our Bengals insider, Charlie Goldsmith. Charlie, how you doing today?
How's it going?
I'll tell you how good it's going. It's raining hard, cold cash money around the National Football League.
That's pretty good.
The Business Sports Journal just reported that the NFL and its fiscal revenue has been reported that the NFL took in a cool $23 billion for the last fiscal year. You and I both know, I think you can go all the way back to 2010 when Commissioner Roger Goodell sort of projected that this was a league that was going to soon to be making $25 billion annually. They're very close to hitting that number, coming in at $23 billion for the last fiscal year. With that said, as you well know, the distribution in terms of their ability to divide that money up, that's shared revenue, and they divide it up amongst the 32 franchises. The Cincinnati Bengals take is going to be a check for $416 million as being reported. With that, you say what? If you hear that the Cincinnati Bengals are going to collect and soon to be getting a check for $416 million, and that's just part of the shared revenue, what comes to mind for you?
Well, first, the raising the cap was a big part of the flexibility that they felt like they needed to make sure that they got those deals with T. Higgins and with Jamar Chase done. Another side of this, too, is kind of the off-field side, what the Bengals have done for their locker room, what they've done for their training room and different recovery things, building at least an interim practice facility. While it's not final, it did cost something. The Bengals improving the stadium engagement, the sound systems, all these types of stuff, the in-game environment. The Bengals have shown a lot of, have translated a lot of that into stuff that the players have felt, that the fans have felt, and that certainly Jamar Chase and T. Higgins have felt.
Look, I think it dispels for our listeners and our viewers who live in the Cincinnati market. We all know that Cincinnati is not one of the big market teams. It's not New York or LA. Some of those markets have two NFL teams. Think about that. One city can support two NFL teams. I think when we go international, I think you're going to find that London, where we do have league offices in London currently, that one day that a city like London could literally host and hold two NFL franchises. But the Cincinnati Bengals are roughly seen as a small market team. But I think these kind of numbers let us know that in reality, the NFL has built a model where the big market teams don't have a whole lot much more over the small market teams. The small market teams can still compete at an economic level.
Well, in theory, certainly, but also when you look at how the Bengals have managed the cap and different, financial levers that they pull, and that's not necessarily an expertise of mine, but you see like the Denver Broncos are willing to eat all of Russell Wilson's dead salary and just keep building your team anyway. The Bengals aren't quite there yet. Obviously the Bengals aren't in this spot with Zach Taylor, but you see teams that are willing to fire their head coach because, even though they don't care how much dead money basically they're going to be paying their head coach over the next couple of years. And again, the Bengals aren't on those positions on either side, but certainly you do see examples of teams that are using some of that revenue in a slightly more aggressive way.
Well, now that we've established that all 32 teams have finished in the black, they finish in plus positive territory. In fact, I can't name a time when one has finished in the red. But now that we all know that they're on fertile, firm ground, if I make the statement that the top quarterbacks in the NFL are overpaid, if we were to use the scales of perception versus reality, to that you would say what? Where do you come down on that statement?
Yeah, I think Joe Burrow is underpaid just because the market keeps resetting every year. And that is an important thing to always be aware of is how much has the market changed? What do changes in the market reflect for the people who need contracts now and represent for kind of in an unpredictable way what the market will look like in 2029 when Joe Burrow is ready to be paid again? I think it's really difficult to project just exactly how high that number can be.
Yeah.
You're only properly paid the year you sign the deal. With how much revenue is getting into the league, that really changes pretty quickly.
And when you see your top two wide receivers earning $69 million, think about the salary cap itself is 279 mil, right? And every single one of these players, none of them are overpaid. You have to understand that they help drive revenue, factored and baked into that salary cap is, and most of that come from television, from their agreements that they've made with the networks. And the networks, they base how much money they're going to pay the NFL for the rights fees based off ratings. Well, who drive ratings more than some of the top names like Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins? And that's why their contracts are comparable to the production and obviously to the popularity of the sport, but to the ratings that they actually drive. You can look for the Cincinnati Bengals to play in prime time during the upcoming 2025 season. I would say probably anywhere from maybe 4 to a half dozen times. And that is probably on the low end, Charlie, right?
It's probably going to be pretty close to the max. This is a Bengals team that has an incredible national spotlight. And that's really important to kind of everything that they're a part of. And you see that translate in a lot of different ways, both on and off the field.
Well, I should let people also know that if you just think about the salary cap itself, and if you're asking yourself, does the quarterback get too much? Because I think there's a lot of people, as I go around to coffee houses and I'm having lunch at the country club where I'm playing golf, and people are thinking, oh, did we pay the quarterback too much? The answer to that is an emphatically no. In fact, he's earned every penny. In fact, if you talk to any of the general managers around the National Football League, it's this imaginary line that they've created that you don't want to pay the quarterback over, say, 25% of the salary cap. Well, right now, as we sit here, there's only one player, one quarterback making over 20% of the salary cap, and that's Dak Prescott at $60 million annually. Joe Burrow doesn't even come close, maybe right up to it, but he's not earning over 20% of the salary cap. So he's well within line for being able to get paid at the top of the market while at the same time leaving the team enough to pay the rest of their players and put a competitive product on the field, Charlie. I think that's really important to designate. Wouldn't you agree?
What's interesting to me is how, like Burrow, Mahomes, Allen, Lamar, these contracts look the same. They feel the same. It's almost like a going rate, a standard. And what that makes is kind of a smaller piece of the pie that you've got to hit on your offensive line draft picks. You've got to hit on, your tight end depth. You've got to hit on scheme. What are the overall ways around that you can kind of get that extra edge when quarterbacks are pretty much being paid around the same price?
Yeah, look, more than enough to go around. Every year the salary cap is going up and up and up. And so with each and every year that your top players stay on the current contract, you're getting more space in terms of your salary cap to be able to add other players. And obviously, to your point, if you draft well, because those players are on rookie contracts, which don't count nearly as much against the cap, if you can hit on those picks, now you're cooking with gas. You have really good players at a bargain basement price. All right, look, I want to talk to you about the upcoming draft and some of the players that I think many people have been sort of attaching to the Cincinnati Bengals. We really do believe they're going to go heavy, maybe in the first and second round on the defensive side of the ball. At some point, they have to address the offensive line, maybe with one of the top interior offensive linemen in this year's draft. I want to start by picking your brain and see what you're hearing said about the following players. Let's start with Alabama linebacker Jihaad Campbell. And many people have him linked to the Bengals with the 17th overall pick in the first round. What do you think about him as a prospect?
Well, the only knock is that he's coming off a shoulder injury that he is now rehabbing from. What I love about him is, one, he would play every single snap right away for a Bengals team that still has a lot of needs and needs a starting linebacker next to Logan Wilson. But then number two, with his quick twitch and athleticism and play recognition and burst, he has real potential to not just be a blitzer, but to win as a blitzer. Some people even think he could line up off the edge and make an impact against certain matchups. pass rush is such a weakness on this Bengals team, but you can't even almost just go in and say, you're going to take the best pass rusher available because you do have such pressing needs on linebacker and at safety. Now, if Derek Harmon's available, certainly you'd entertain that, but Campbell kind of helps with both. He fills a position of need. He'll make a lot of plays. He shows great range against the run and the pass as a tackler. And he'd also probably right away be this Bengals team's second or third best pass rusher. He checks 2 boxes.
Look, and I don't want to put too much of an expectation on Jihaad Campbell, but I go back to the 2021 draft. That was the same year the Bengals took Jamar Chase, by the way. The Dallas Cowboys selected an interior off-ball linebacker by the name of Michael Parsons. And remember, Parsons was sort of an off-ball linebacker, hadn't really done a lot of pass rushing unless he was a blitzing linebacker when he was at Penn State. It looked like they needed an edge rusher. I remember him going to the defensive coordinator, Dan Quinn, and saying, look, I can rush the quarterback. He put his hand on the ground and a star was born. He had never played that position. I think that's what you mean when you talk about Jihaad Campbell. If he has to come off the edge and be a stand-up linebacker on the edge or put a hand on the ground as a rush defensive end, you believe he has the talent to do that, as well as being that off-ball Mike linebacker on regular downs.
He's not Trey Hendrickson, but he has the ability to do it, and it gives the Bengals, will give the Bengals a lot of flexibility and a lot of ability to be creative. Yeah. Kind of the question at linebacker is how steady and sure, or almost conservative does Al Golden want that unit to be? It had been a more conservative unit. Logan and Wilson have played terrific, but they sat back. They, for the most part, tackled until 2024 with Pratt in particular. They sat back. They tackled. They were fundamentally sound and solid. Mm-hmm. But with the desperate need for more playmaking, with the loss of Mike Hilton, who kind of was that unpredictable wild card, the Bengals kind of need that. That can come from the linebacker position, and Campbell has the versatility to do all those things.
I still can't believe we're going to take the field in 2025 without Mike Hilton. He was so good at so many different things. I think he's going to be sorely missed. The next player I want to get your thoughts on him, Georgia's safety, Malaki Starks. This is a guy that's a phenomenal player. He has the first-round grade on him. I think he could be there when the Bengals go on the clock at 17. What can you tell us about him?
I have him neck and neck with Campbell on my big board. Another guy who fills that playmaking, versatility, ball hawk, scheme, creativity description. And what's a bit not lacking, and it's not even necessarily a problem when you look at free safeties around the league, he doesn't have the elite athletic testing. There are certain, and that shows up to an extent on his tape as well. But when you look at his ability to be a true free safety, which there really aren't enough of or many of at the top of this year's class. That's right. You look at his ability to do that, plus the flexibility and the versatility and the ball instincts. He solves a lot of concerns about the Bengals defense, and like Campbell, he steps in and immediately plays 100% of the snaps.
Either way, the Cincinnati Bengals are in need of a dynamic playmaker on the defensive side of the ball, whether it's as a pass rusher, whether it's as a linebacker who can do both, or whether it's as a safety or corner in the secondary, a guy who has a nose to find the football and make us forget about losing Jesse Bates, because that name is going to continue to keep coming up until we find an adequate replacement of a guy who can take the ball away from opposing offenses. Want to get your thoughts on Ohio State offensive guard Donovan Jackson. Maybe not in the first round, but maybe a day 2 pick.
Yeah, this Bengals team, as we all know, needs help in the interior of their offensive line. And there's a strong pocket. Like, I feel pretty good about the Bengals ending up with Jackson or Tate Ratledge or Jonas Avenaya or Miles Frazier. But Jackson, what stood out the most was his combination of pedigree and length and quickness and power and consistency. Put all that together, and that's a guy this Ohio State coaching staff just had a ton of trust in. When the season was on the line and they were desperate, he kicked out to left tackle. He played pretty solid. And sure, that flexibility is a nice little feather in his cap as well, but he's good enough to win and be successful at guard. He's just the type of guy I feel like will be in the league for a long time. He very much checks the boxes that the Bengals typically go for when they use any high round pick in general, winning experience, big school leadership experience, pedigree. And he played well as well in college. So definitely a lot to like here.
Well, we're 2 weeks away from the NFL draft. It's going to be an exciting time. This draft is going to be held in Green Bay, Wisconsin. That's right, in a very historic location. As you well know, Green Bay means a lot to the National Football League. It's one of those teams, anyway, that is a chartered member of a league that's over 105 years old. Let's go to our mailbag, Charlie, because last week we asked for some of our viewers and listeners to send us some questions by going to our mailbag, and they have a few questions for us, and I'll allow you to respond. This is Zach Farmer, who is saying no questionable attitudes or personalities in the first round. He said we don't need to have it. He talks about Jermaine Burton, but we're going to talk about him in a little bit. But he says we have to hit on the early picks. You know that's right. I know that's right. First of all, give me an update on Jermaine Burton. What's going on with him, and what can we expect from him in 2025?
Well, to be honest with Burton, no news is good news. Let's get him to OTAs. Let's see how he's approaching it and how he's handling. And Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, one didn't show up to OTAs last year, which was fine. But even if they do show up this year, they won't be getting a ton of snaps. Burton will be getting a lot of snaps. Let's see how he's handling. Let's see how he's processing. Let's see how he's matured. Bengals actually a quiet need for the Bengals is kick returner, and Burton was actually a good kick returner. Yeah. So that's kind of still an area he can still contribute, as they'd love for him to go at receiver. Receiver 4 in particular is a weak spot or is an unproven spot on the depth chart. So let's see how Burton looks this year.
All right. The next message comes from Bengals fandom. And he writes, supposedly the Bengals offered Trey Hendrickson $28 million just last week, and Trey wanted between 32 and 35 mil. So they offered him additional incentives to hit those numbers, but Trey turned it down. Charlie, you have any inside information on whether or not this happened?
I don't, but what we know, I think we talked about this last week too. What we know is what Trey said publicly, and Trey was telling the truth there. Trey wants a multi-year deal with a lot of guaranteed money that establishes himself at the premier of that defensive end market, and the Bengals aren't willing to go there. And, it's not that it's straightforward, but it's kind of straightforward. There's just a gap between how the two sides view where they stand, and I expect this to continue to be drawn out.
Could you see the team maybe offering some form of incentives to hit those numbers to ensure that maybe a defensive lineman who's 30 plus years of age is going to be there on game day? Okay, if we're going to pay you at the top of the market, then we have to have some assurances that you'll be there. And if not, then maybe 25 to 28 mil is the number. Could you see that as a possible scenario?
Trey answered that one for us too. He said he doesn't want to be playing for a lot of incentives that feel like they're out of his control. So I guess not.
There you go. With that, I think Bengals fandom, that answers your question. I think it was a really good, clever way of getting that question in. And it's a very good question by you. This is from Taylor Port. We should take a safety in the first round. He's kind of sharing the brain with us here, isn't he? And I want to ask you about Nick Imawari from South Carolina. He is Malaki Starks, Xavier Watts. Those are maybe the three names that we're hearing most closely linked to the Cincinnati Bengals if you're taking a safety that early.
So Malaki Starks will probably end up number 2, maybe number 2 or number 3. I haven't come down on my opinion on Derek Harmon yet, but Malaki Starks will rank very, very highly on my Bengals big board. So yes, it is a possibility that the Bengals take a safety in round 1. Nick Imawari is going to be on there as well, maybe more in the 5 to 8 range. 10 out of 10 relative athletic score, unbelievable athleticism. Watch the guy run with the ball, and you're like, I want him on my team. The thing is, he is more of a box safety, more of a versatility without the deep center field post element as something he can fall back on. And the Bengals have Jordan Battle, and they're going to start Jordan Battle. So you would prefer that center field option that Starks brings to the table. If it were Imawari, he'd kind of be in more of a hybrid linebacker role. 3 safety sets. Can he run the alley against the run and lay down some bigger hits? Even though that's not really who he was at South Carolina, there's some more projection there, but there is a whole lot of, even more creativity than Starks, because the athletic skill set gives you as much to work with as anyone in this year's draft.
Imawari is more of a projection, but giving the decathlete status that he earned by his measurables at the combine, you can see why that projection sort of it's more about what we hope he will produce, but there's not been a lot of evidence that that kind of production will follow. And I think that's something you have to be careful about. Giovanni has a note here, and basically he's talking about Jermaine Burton. He says that Jermaine Burton has already received maybe too much punishment. He said, look, they love to get a player like that, but he says BPA, best player available. Would you agree with that, Charlie?
The Bengals don't have the flexibility to take best player available, specifically on day 2, with how many needs they've left themselves having to fill through the draft. So, like, I'd love to be able to get a day 2 tight end in here. I'd love to be able to get a day 2 running back in here. Every team could use more corners. You know, another example is like the Bengals will look here, but the round 2 edge guys are my favorite pocket of players in this year's draft. But if the Bengals need a round 2 guard, they're going to have to take a round 2 guard, and they're just going to have to miss out on all those players. So I think what you'll see really is best player available at positions of need, and you'll see it really play out in round 1. They'll probably end up with the guard on round 2, play out a bit in round 3, and then by round 4, they'll be drafting for need.
Drafting for need. Yeah. And you're right. It's a luxury to be able to take best player available. There is no doubt about it. This question comes from Brandon Houday. And he says, holy crap, I didn't realize Myles Murphy just turned 23 in January. Is he still really young for an upcoming third-year player? And then he also asked, can he turn into a better version of Sam Hubbard?
The Bengals would love to have the answer to this question. The Bengals are counting on the answer to that question being yes, but kind of some uncertainty there is why we're going to be talking about the pass rush on every episode until the Bengals actually prove they can rush the passer. I do think Murphy had a better season than people recognized last year. The 0 sacks is the glaring red flag of glaring red flags, but still consistent knockback, consistent ability to chase down quarterbacks. You could see him getting more confident, more comfortable. They're counting on a big leap from him. They don't know what to expect. Maybe less Sam Hubbard because the speed and the rush are his biggest strengths. Hubbard was so much of a power guy. So different styles of players, but certainly Murphy could be as good as Sam Hubbard, and Hubbard was a borderline Pro Bowler in his prime.
Yeah. This next question comes from Glenn. He says, when Jermaine Pratt said, what missed tackles? It clearly showed that he has no grasp or self-awareness to understand his problem. He goes on to ask, what's going on with Jermaine Pratt in terms of as the Bengals are now and all the other teams now coming back for OTAs, he wants to know the status of Jermaine Pratt, who we all know earlier this offseason asked to be traded.
Yeah, earlier this offseason, it sounded like a guarantee that the Bengals would be moving in a different direction. You know, even as recently as a couple days ago on the team website, you know, the linebackers coach does a Q&A and he's asked about the room and he does not mention Jermaine Pratt. So, I mean, that in itself shows that there's no guarantee that Pratt's a part of their plans. However, you know, if, you know, let's say they take Starks in round 1 and they take Jackson in round 2. Yeah. And in round 3, one of these strong defensive tackles is on the board. I'll have to go through like Norman Lott, let's say they really like. And then you Taj Brooks at running back in round 4. Yeah. He could take over for Samaje Perine and you like him. And in round 5, you know, there's a scenario where now you're in round 5 and you don't have a linebacker. And the Bengals could certainly end up a scenario where they kind of go back to Jermaine and say, can we reconsider things? But they're not there yet, so it doesn't sound like those conversations have happened yet.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good way of answering that. The next question is from the Gaffer, and he brings up Nick Imawari from South Carolina. You and I were talking about him earlier. He says Nick Imawari at 17 feels a need in the secondary and in their defensive backfield. He is the best athlete available. Will they select him with the 17th overall pick if he's available?
It depends, right? Best player available, positions of need. I feel pretty comfortable in Starks, Campbell, Harmon as a tier of their own. The group of players I'm having the trickiest time with are when you get to the next tier, and I'm pulling up my big board right now. You have Imawari, who we talked about his physical athletic traits, and then they're kind of like the Imawaris of defensive ends who are true projects profile, almost like Amarius Mims's. That's Shamar Stewart, and that's Michael Williams in particular. I haven't quite slotted how I would rank those 3 guys. And then behind them, or you can make the case over them, but I'm probably behind them now, are the offensive guards in Banks and Booker. But Imawari is certainly on that board. It's just if the defensive playmakers you prefer are gone, do you take that chance? Do you go with an even rawer player on the defensive line, or do you look for some sort of safer option at offensive guard?
Really good stuff from our Bengals insider, Charlie Goldsmith. Charlie, really good stuff. We're running out of time. We have to say goodbye, but we want to thank you for sending in those questions to our mailbag. Want to send in more, and we'll answer those questions on next week's episode. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll see you again next week.